you get the point? We may suffer now, but those around us face a suffering infinitely worse. Stay standing and I'll pray for us. Heavenly Father, Jesus said that if we were to follow him, we need to take up our cross and bear the suffering that comes with being known as his. And Father, we pray that you would speak to us through this passage, that you would strengthen us if we're facing that now, and that you'd steady us that we may face it better in the future. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Please do take a seat. Back in the day when I was doing my maths GCSEs, I had two teachers. Both of them were great, but they were very different. One of them was obviously a natural mathematician. I don't know, but I suspect she got a first at uni. She was passionate about her subject and head of the department. Let's call her Mrs. Perfect. The second openly admitted that she found maths hard. She'd very often say things like, yes, now when I was trying to get my head around that, this is what helped me. Let's call her Miss Approachable. I'll let you into a secret. I loved maths, but at times I also found it a struggle. And when I did find things hard, can you guess which teacher I went to? It wasn't Mrs. Perfect. She would just end up getting frustrated with me and say things like, "It's obvious, isn't it? Why can't you see it?" No, when I was struggling, the teacher who had herself persevered through her own struggles was who I turned to for help. She understood what it was to struggle. She was the one who was able to help me not to give up. Tonight in our series in 1 Peter, we come to chapter 4, verses 12 to 19, which is all about how we should react when we suffer for following Jesus, when we suffer because we are Christians. So turn back with me to that passage. It's in page 1016 in the Bibles. There's an outline on the back, and we'll be led through that outline on the screens. Peter, who'd been one of Jesus' closest friends and who was now the pastor of the church in Jerusalem, wrote this letter to Christians who were struggling. He wrote to teach them, to encourage them, to comfort them, to challenge them. But it's worth remembering that Peter knew firsthand both what it was like to suffer for being a Christian and what it was like to do that badly. All four of the Gospels record his dramatic denial of Jesus. Here is Luke, chapter 22, verses 54 and onwards. As I read through these verses, perhaps this triggers a similar memory, a similar incident in your own life. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following Jesus at a distance. And when they'd kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. So tonight we hear not from Mr. Perfect Peter, but from Mr. Approachable Peter. We learn how we can suffer well when the need arises for following Jesus. Look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. "Beloved, He really does care and love them. Do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Don't be surprised, Peter says to his readers, at the fiery trial that you're experiencing. Don't think it's strange that you're suffering. Don't expect that following Jesus will make you healthy and wealthy and popular. God's work in and through Jesus is at the center of 1 Peter's message. Throughout the letter, we've seen this. Jesus is the one whose blood we have been ransomed. He's the one through whose resurrection God has given us new birth. He's the living stone rejected by the builders, but chosen by God. Jesus is the cornerstone on which God's house is built. But Jesus is also the suffering Christ, in whose footsteps we are called to follow. And if Christ suffered, it should come as no surprise that his followers suffer too. These verses aren't talking about the problem of suffering in general. It's not a reflection on why good people struggle with physical or mental illness, why people die in car accidents or have their lives overturned by natural disasters. It's not that kind of suffering. It's also not talking about the suffering that comes from departing from God's ways. This isn't about the kind of suffering that comes, as it says in verse 15, to those who are a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler. No, these are words of hope and reassurance for people who are facing abuse, facing social rejection, public humiliation, simply because they follow Jesus. You see that in verse 14. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Those verses bring to mind Jesus' teachings in Matthew 5, when he said, this is Matthew 5, verse 11, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." But we also see that this is what Peter is talking about in verse 16. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. We know that for many Christians around the world, to follow Jesus brings suffering. Some are cut off from families, others face the loss of their jobs. And Peter's not making light of that. He calls what they're facing a fiery trial. It's hard. It's painful. It lasts a long time. It may even demand our lives. But what about you? What has come to your mind as I've spoken about suffering as a Christian? Do you remember a time perhaps when you received verbal abuse or where people made fun of you in public? Maybe that's happening right now among your friends, in your family, with a boss, among your colleagues or students, perhaps even from your teacher. Well, for the rest of our time, let's look through these verses and see what Peter says about how we should face such situations. And this is the first thing he says, don't be surprised. That's from verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. Imagine, if you would, someone who moves to a different country for a time. An international student, perhaps. Lots of things will be different. The language, the weather, everything is unfamiliar and confusing. They face culture shock. That's tough, but not unexpected. And most people do eventually adapt and adjust. But what's often worse is when the time comes to go back home. This time they face reverse culture shock. They have changed, life back home has moved on, and so yet again things are unfamiliar and confusing. But this time it's even worse, because they haven't expected it. This is home. Why should it be difficult? And if that's coming up for you, then what will help is if you do expect it. And it's the same with suffering. We need to be prepared for it, or we'll give up. We'll end up confused. We'll wonder if God has abandoned us or whether God is punishing us. We'll grow angry and bitter towards God. We'll become anxious about our situations. Well, don't be caught off guard. Suffering will come, but God is still at work, bringing you to himself. Well, secondly, we are to rejoice despite our sufferings. That's from verse 13. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Peter tells us to rejoice. There are two reasons. Firstly, suffering because of following Jesus is designed to drive us away from him. But instead, our suffering can draw us to him. We suffer with him. We suffer together. Jesus and I walk the same way. There is a solidarity in suffering, in walking the same way that our suffering Saviour walked. And so rejoice as you share in the sufferings of Jesus. Just like we read, Peter did in Acts chapter 5, verse 41. Just after he'd been arrested for speaking about Jesus, we read these words. The apostles left the Sanhedrin, rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for his name. Well, that's the first reason. The second reason we are to rejoice is because God is using suffering for good and for our godliness. We've seen that already in chapter 1. He is testing our faith and refining our character. We share his suffering now, and we'll also share his glory later. Remember, we saw this in chapter 1, verses 6 to 9. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And though you've not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, salvation of your souls. Thirdly, we're to remember God's Spirit is with us. That's from verse 14. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. There's overtones here of Isaiah 11, where it was promised that God's Spirit would rest on the Messiah so that the Messiah could carry out his mission. And don't gloss over these verses. They're incredible. Peter says that the same Spirit is now on us if we've come to trust in Jesus. How do we know? Because we're suffering in his name. That is a sign that we now belong to God, that God's Spirit is with us. We've been given his Spirit, and God will not abandon us. We belong to him. He's at work in us. He will comfort us and help us to live for him through our suffering. So remember, God's Spirit is with you. And then fourthly, do not be ashamed of Jesus. This is from verse 16. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. When I moved to Newcastle and started at university, there was no social media. Yes, it was that long ago. Paper was the main way of attracting your attention. And I remember walking through Castle Leazer's halls on my first day there with someone who was also a fresher. I'd met him. We were sitting on the train as we both travelled to Newcastle. And as we walked around halls, everywhere we looked, there were posters about churches or the Christian Union. Obviously, Christians were the only ones who cared enough to come back early, and they had covered the place with posters. And I remember this friend launching into this huge rant about how much he hated Christians and what he thought of them. He obviously then realized that he hardly knew me, and he stopped and he asked, "Oh, you're not religious, are you?" It was my first day at uni. Was I willing to risk losing the best and longest lasting friend I had? After all, I'd known him for all of 3 hours. Or would I deny the one who loved me so much that he gave his son to die on a cross so that I could be forgiven. What, me? No, I'm not religious. Well, that was over 20 years ago, and I've not changed. Yet things have got harder now. Back then, Christians ran the risk of being seen as strange. Now, we're more likely to be perceived as harmful. But yet, Peter says we're not to be ashamed. He knows how hard it is. But he urges us instead to glorify God in that name. In other words, to live in such a way that we reflect his character and we take those opportunities to speak of him when they come. If we're ridiculed as Christians, if we're mocked because we follow Jesus, we're not to be ashamed. Being associated with Jesus is not an insult, but a badge of honor. And then fifthly, and actually I think this is the main thrust of what Peter is saying to us tonight. Remember, Jesus is coming again. This comes from verses 17 to 18. Peter says this, "For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner?" What Peter says here is very powerful. This is how we can have the correct perspective in the middle of our suffering. He teaches us to allow the suffering we face to remind us that the end is coming. And when it does, we will all face God's judgment. Look, I know we don't like thinking about judgment. I don't like talking about it. But as Peter looked at the hardships and the persecutions suffered by God's people, he saw the first stirrings of the coming judgment of God. The judgment that would eventually spread to all the earth, but the judgment that right now was beginning with God's own house. This theme of Jesus coming again has come up repeatedly throughout the chapter. Just glance back to chapter 4, verse 5. "But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." Chapter 4, verse 7. "The end of all things is at hand." And then verse 13 talks of that future day when Jesus' glory is revealed. Now, for Christians, that judgment purifies. Suffering for being a Christian proves and strengthens our trust in our faithful Creator. Suffering sobers us up. It focuses our minds on Christ, who's already faced and dealt with our suffering for us. But though we may face suffering, at the end of the day, we face a certain future. We will be saved. And so we can rejoice. But for those who do not believe, there is little to rejoice about. When God's judgment comes, it brings with it everlasting ruin. So we must, even in our suffering, keep firmly in mind that God's judgment is near. And Peter says, continue undeterred in doing good, and especially to speak about Jesus. To help drive this point home, I want to read to you some words from a book called The Shock of Your Life by Adrian Holloway. If you don't know it, it brings home to its readers the reality that Jesus is coming back. This is how it begins. "For heaven's sake, Daniel, come on, we're going to be late. That's how my mum woke me up on the 10th of July, 2012. Weird to think how normal a day it was. Mum was giving me a lift to college, and I was always late getting up. It was the mind-numbing predictability of it all that still gets me. I've since thought that Mum probably said exactly the same thing the previous year at exactly the same time in the morning. But you'd think the day you die would have some sort of spooky build-up with spooky music. Rather, I got dressed watching breakfast TV. How did I die? In the back of the car, sitting next to my sister who was reading a Simpsons book, while I half listened to some sad local radio phone-in my mum wanted on. 10 minutes into the journey, sometime after 8:30 in the morning, I was dead. We were hit by a lorry on a dual carriageway. I can draw you a map if you like. It's a novel, and in the novel, Daniel is a 17-year-old non-Christian. I'm not going to spoil the story, but when he dies, he discovers what happens to people when they die. He realizes that God is real, that we're all accountable to him, that there is a final judgment for all, no matter who you are and what you believe, and that Jesus Christ is the judge at this final judgment. He also discovers that Jesus will know everything you've ever thought or said or done. It will be known that everyone has sinned and fallen short of God's perfect standard, that everyone deserves the punishment of death because we've sinned against God. But Daniel also discovered that those whose names were found in the book of life would escape death. This is how the Bible describes that day, when Jesus would judge the living and the dead. This is Revelation chapter 20, verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. Earth and sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. The punishment for sin is death. That is the terrifying reality that confronts Dan and each one of us. But Dan also discovered something else. He discovered that God loves us so much that he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die in our place. He discovers that those who follow Jesus avoid that punishment of death and receive forgiveness. In fact, they're considered as blameless as Christ himself. Those are the ones whose name appear in the book of life, and they go to heaven. In that book, Dan is not the only character. There's also someone called Becky. Becky, too, died in the same car crash as Dan. She was a believer. Her name was in the book of life. And so here now is another quote from the book when Becky is standing at that day of judgment watching as Dan comes face to face with Jesus, his creator and judge. This is what she says. It was a bloke, a teenager. Hang on, I said to the angel. This looks like... No, it couldn't be. It was the kid I knew from college, Daniel Adams. I looked at his face, which I'd seen all through school and college. Then a picture flashed into my mind. The sick, motionless boy in the car wreckage. Oh no, that was him. That was Daniel Adams. Now I recognized him. It was definitely Daniel in the car and Daniel in front of me. Suddenly everything fell into place. He died moments before I did, and now he was being judged. But was he a Christian? Of course he wasn't. No, he was just a normal kid at school. Oh no. Why couldn't a Christian have told him about Jesus? A pause. I stopped. Then I realized I could have told him. I may have been the only person who could have told him. I could have told Daniel Adams about Jesus and forgiveness and judgment. I had that chance and I didn't. And now it was too late. I screamed no, and I began running back towards Daniel. The angel grabbed me. Becky, Jesus will judge justly. Please let me go. You don't understand. I struggled trying to get free. I knew this one. It was Daniel Adams. He's going to hell and it's my fault. No, the angel said, it's not your fault if he goes to hell. It's his own sin that will take him there if that's where he ends up. Look, said Becky, he died in the same accident as me. He wasn't ready. Please let me go. But the angel wouldn't let me go back. Becky says, how would Daniel have known about Jesus? He would never have seen anything distinct in me. He would never have seen something authentic. He should have seen a clear line between a Christian and a non-Christian. But he probably didn't have a clue about Jesus and the cross. I'd failed him. I was so gutted. Of course, I didn't go around telling people at school about Jesus. I wanted people to like me. I didn't want to be rejected. Besides, I was scared. Okay, that's not true. I wasn't scared. But I wanted to have respect. I didn't want people to think I was sad or a pain. I just wanted to be normal. Incredible, isn't it? Saved from hell by Jesus, but I hardly told anyone who needed to know. It all now seemed so stupid. Yet on earth, it was just the way I was. Somehow, religious, spiritual things didn't seem real enough for me to talk about them. I know that was a long quote, but do you get the point? We may suffer now, but those around us face a suffering infinitely worse. And it was that fact that leads Peter to his final conclusion. And with this point, I'll end. We are to entrust our soul to our Creator and to continue to do good. That is how we respond to suffering. And this is from verse 19. Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. I love that verse. I think it's amazing. It's a summary, actually, of the whole book. It's worth committing to memory. Jesus suffered. He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. When we suffer, we are to do the same. In this verse, Peter talks of the Creator God. He reminds us that he is sovereign over all things and faithful in everything he does. We are to live as exiles, suffering exiles, without surprise or despair, and with a joy-filled, God-glorifying trust, doing good no matter what the world throws at us. Look, we are in a spiritual battle. The enemy wants to stop us talking about Jesus, and one of the things he does is to throw suffering at us. He wants to shut us up. But we have God's Spirit, and he will enable us to keep talking about Jesus, because we know that the end of all things is at hand. We do need to expect suffering, but for those of us in England, let's not get this out of proportion. For the vast majority of us in this country, we still have huge freedoms and opportunities. We just don't use them. Suffering is to be expected, and when it comes, we should pray, as Peter prayed in Acts chapter 4, verse 29. Lord, look upon their threats and grant to your servants to continue to speak your words with all boldness. Let's pray. Well, thank you for the wonderful truths that we find in this part of your word. Thank you most of all for your Spirit who walks with us, who enables us to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. And Father, we pray that you would awaken in each one of us that reality that you will one day bring this world to an end. That whatever suffering we face is but light and momentary troubles. Father, keep us looking to that day when we will see you face to face, when we will share not your suffering as we do now, but your glory. And Father, help us too, despite our sufferings, to never stop speaking of you and of how wonderful you are. We ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.